Friedrich Nietzsche, that mad prophet of the 19th century who declared God dead and warned of nihilism's approach, would look at contemporary progressive culture with a mixture of vindication and horror. His darkest predictions about the slave revolt and morals haven't just come true, they've achieved total cultural victory in a way that would make him reach for his philosophical hammer with unprecedented fury. The man who spent his career diagnosing the sickness of Western civilization would find in 2025's woke ideology the perfect specimen of everything he warned against: a complete inversion of life-affirming values, the triumph of ressentiment over creativity, and the systematic destruction of human excellence in the name of equality. The man who wrote, "What does not kill me makes me stronger," would witness a generation of college students demanding trigger warnings, safe spaces, and protection from ideas that might cause psychological discomfort. But this isn't merely weakness, it's something far more sinister in Nietzschean terms. It's the complete inversion of values, where strength becomes toxic, suffering becomes sacred, and the very concept of overcoming adversity is seen as oppressive to those who cannot or will not overcome. Nietzsche believed that suffering was the forge in which great souls were created, that adversity was the necessary catalyst for human growth, and that the attempt to eliminate struggle from human existence was tantamount to eliminating what makes us human. The safe space culture represents everything he despised about what he called the last man, those comfortable, risk-averse creatures who seek only pleasure and avoid pain, who have discovered happiness and blink contentedly in their mediocrity. Nietzsche's concept of slave morality, the tendency of the weak to redefine virtue as whatever they are and vice as whatever the strong are, finds its perfect expression in woke ideology. Where master morality celebrates strength, beauty, excellence, and natural hierarchy, progressive morality has inverted every single value. Success is privilege, competence is oppression, and achievement is evidence of an unjust system. The very fact that some people excel while others struggle is treated not as a natural fact about human inequality, but as a moral failing of society itself. This represents a fundamental misunderstanding of what Nietzsche saw as the basic structure of reality, that inequality is not a bug in the system but the very engine of human progress, that the tension between strong and weak, excellent and mediocre, is what drives civilization forward. The philosopher who celebrated the Übermensch, the overman who creates his own values through strength and will, would be nauseated by the intersectional oppression Olympics, where people compete to be the most victimized, the most marginalized, the most oppressed. Victim status has become the highest form of social currency, and this would strike Nietzsche as the ultimate triumph of the sick over the healthy, the weak over the strong, the life-denying over the life-affirming. In Nietzsche's vision, the Übermensch was supposed to be a creator of values, someone who could say, "This is how things should be," and have the strength to make it so. Instead, we have a culture that celebrates those who can most effectively complain about how things are, who can most convincingly perform their powerlessness, who can most skillfully weaponize their weakness. Consider how thoroughly feminism embodies everything Nietzsche despised about slave morality. The feminist insistence that any differences in outcomes between men and women must be due to oppression rather than natural differences would be seen by Nietzsche as a fundamental denial of reality. He believed in natural aristocracy, that some people are simply better than others at certain things, and that this inequality is not a bug in the system but a feature of life itself. Feminism's egalitarian assumptions represent exactly the kind of life-denying ideology that Nietzsche saw as Christianity's poisoned gift to Western civilization. The feminist framework doesn't just demand equal treatment, it demands equal outcomes, which necessarily means handicapping the strong to accommodate the weak, lowering standards to ensure inclusion, and treating excellence as inherently suspect. The feminist concept of toxic masculinity would particularly enrage Nietzsche. Here is an ideology that has taken the very qualities that drive human greatness, male aggression, competition, dominance, the will to power, and pathologized them as mental illness. The feminist hatred of male nature would look to Nietzsche like an attempt to castrate the Übermensch before he can even emerge. They've taken the raw material of human excellence and declared it toxic, preferring instead the domesticated, neutered, sensitivity-trained male who apologizes for his very existence. This isn't just an attack on men, it's an attack on the masculine principle itself, the drive to overcome, to dominate, to create through strength rather than to accommodate through weakness. But Nietzsche's critique would go even deeper. He would see modern feminism not as a legitimate response to oppression, but as ressentiment in its purest form, the revenge of those who cannot create against those who can. The feminist obsession with tearing down male achievement, with quotas and diversity mandates, with constant complaints about representation, all of this would strike him as the classic slave morality move of destroying what you cannot attain rather than striving to attain it yourself. Instead of women creating their own excellence, their own achievements, their own values, feminism has focused obsessively on limiting male excellence, on ensuring that men cannot achieve too much lest it make women feel bad about their own limitations. The gender pay gap discourse would exemplify this perfectly for Nietzsche. Rather than asking, how can women become more valuable in the marketplace, feminism asks, how can we force the marketplace to value women equally regardless of their actual contributions? Rather than inspiring women to work harder, take more risks, develop more skills, the feminist response is to demand that the rules be changed so that working harder, taking risks, and developing skills become less important. This is slave morality at its most pure, the weak demanding that the strong be weakened rather than the weak becoming strong. The transgender movement would present Nietzsche with an even more perfect example of nihilistic self-destruction. Here is an ideology that denies the most basic biological reality, that there are two sexes, in favor of a purely constructed, will-based identity. On one hand, Nietzsche might initially admire the sheer audacity of declaring, "I will be whatever I say I am." It sounds almost like the Übermensch creating his own values. But he would quickly realize that this isn't creation but destruction, not the affirmation of life but its denial. The transgender movements demand that everyone else participate in their self-created reality, backed by the threat of social ostracism and legal punishment, would look to him like the ultimate expression of slave morality, the weak forcing their values on the strong through moral blackmail. The transgender ideology represents nihilism in its purest form, the denial of biological reality in favor of subjective experience. Nietzsche valued truth, even painful truth, over comfortable lies. He would see the transgender movement's insistence that biological sex is assigned at birth rather than observed, that gender identity trumps physical reality, that surgical mutilation can actually change someone's sex, as a fundamental attack on the very concept of truth itself. They've created a system where reality must bow to ideology, where objective facts become hate speech, where the very attempt to maintain basic categories like man and woman becomes a form of violence. The pronouns obsession would particularly amuse and disgust Nietzsche. Here is a movement that has managed to make language itself a battlefield, where the simple act of referring to someone becomes a political statement. The philosopher who believed in the power of language to create reality would be horrified by how that power has been weaponized by the weak to control the strong. Every time someone is forced to say, they or them, for a single person, slave morality scores another victory over truth and natural language. The pronouns movement has managed to turn basic grammar into a loyalty test, where your willingness to participate in linguistic absurdity becomes a measure of your moral worth. But the transgender movement's most insidious aspect would be how it targets children. Nietzsche believed that children represented humanity's future, that they needed to be strengthened and prepared for life's challenges. Instead, the transgender ideology tells confused children that their discomfort with their bodies is actually evidence that they're trapped in the wrong body, that their natural developmental struggles are actually signs of gender dysphoria, that the solution to psychological distress is surgical mutilation. This would strike Nietzsche as the ultimate betrayal of the young. Instead of helping them overcome their struggles and accept their reality, we're encouraging them to retreat into fantasy and destroy their bodies in the process. Nietzsche would see the entire woke project as Christianity without God, the same self-hatred, the same celebration of weakness, the same inversion of natural values, but now without even the promise of heavenly reward. At least Christian slaves could look forward to inheriting the earth in the afterlife. Woke slaves want to inherit it right now, and they're willing to destroy it in the process. The secular morality of progressivism has kept all of Christianity's life-denying elements, the guilt, the self-flagellation, the elevation of suffering, the hatred of strength and beauty, while discarding the transcendent framework that at least gave meaning to the suffering. The university campus, once the place where young minds were forged in the fire of intellectual combat, has become a daycare center for overgrown children who cannot bear to hear ideas that challenge their worldview. The concept of emotional safety in what should be the most intellectually dangerous place in society would strike Nietzsche as the final victory of the last man, the comfortable, risk-averse creature who wants only pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Universities have transformed from institutions that created strong minds capable of grappling with difficult truths into therapeutic spaces that protect fragile egos from uncomfortable realities. The trigger warning phenomenon would particularly horrify Nietzsche. Here is a system that assumes students are so fragile that they cannot even encounter descriptions of violence, sexuality, or conflict without psychological damage. The philosopher who believed that art and literature should be dangerous, that great works necessarily disturb and challenge their audience, would see trigger warnings as the death of culture itself. They've created a generation that approaches great works of art and literature not as challenges to be overcome but as traumas to be avoided. The cancel culture that polices university discourse would represent to Nietzsche the ultimate triumph of mediocrity over excellence. When brilliant professors can be destroyed for expressing heterodox views, when students can ruin careers by taking offense at perfectly reasonable statements, when the entire academic enterprise becomes subordinated to the emotional comfort of the weakest participants, you have a system that actively selects against intellectual courage and independent thought. The result is a race to the bottom where everyone learns to think and speak like everyone else, where conformity becomes the highest virtue and originality becomes a career-ending liability. But perhaps most damning of all would be Nietzsche's assessment of progressive anti-racism. Here is a movement that has taken the noble goal of treating people equally and turned it into an obsession with racial differences, a constant cataloging of grievances, and a never-ending demand for reparations and acknowledgement of historical wrongs. The critical race theory framework, with its insistence that white people are inherently racist and must constantly atone for their privilege, would look to Nietzsche like the most sophisticated slave morality ever devised. They've created a system where an entire race is assigned permanent guilt, where competence and achievement by white people becomes evidence of systemic oppression, where the very attempt to treat people as individuals becomes proof of racism. The anti-racists demand that white people constantly examine their privilege, confess their racism, and center the experiences of people of color would be seen by Nietzsche as a brilliant psychological manipulation. The weak have convinced the strong that their strength is actually a moral failing. They've created a system where competence is evidence of unfair advantage, where success is proof of oppression, and where the very attempt to treat people as individuals rather than racial categories is itself racist. This represents the complete inversion of moral logic. Instead of celebrating those who overcome obstacles, we're supposed to feel guilty about not having obstacles. Instead of admiring achievement, we're supposed to see it as evidence of injustice. The concept of white fragility would particularly enrage Nietzsche. Here is a framework that pathologizes any white person's attempt to defend themselves against accusations of racism. If you deny being racist, that's fragility. If you provide evidence against racism, that's fragility. If you express frustration with constantly being called racist, that's fragility. They've created an unfalsifiable system where the accusation of racism becomes impossible to refute. Any attempt to defend yourself becomes further evidence of your guilt. This is psychological warfare disguised as moral education, a system designed to break down the target's psychological resistance through constant accusations and the elimination of any legitimate defense. Nietzsche would be particularly scathing about the way progressives have turned oppression into a competitive sport. The intersectional framework, where people accumulate oppression points based on their various identity categories, would strike him as the sickest possible perversion of human competition. Instead of competing to be the strongest, most capable, most excellent, people are competing to be the most oppressed, most marginalized, most victimized. They've turned weakness into a virtue and suffering into a crown. The intersectional hierarchy creates a system where your moral worth is inversely proportional to your capability. The less you can do, the more valuable you are. The more you suffer, the more you should be celebrated. The progressive obsession with lived experience as a form of knowledge would horrify Nietzsche. Here is an epistemology that privileges subjective suffering over objective truth, personal grievance over universal principle, and emotional testimony over rational argument. The idea that being oppressed somehow gives you special access to truth would strike him as the ultimate slave morality move, the weak claiming that their weakness actually makes them more knowledgeable than the strong. They've created a system where the less you know about something, the more qualified you are to speak about it, provided you can claim some form of victimization related to the topic. This epistemological framework explains why progressive discourse has become so immune to evidence and argument. When your entire worldview is based on the premise that oppressed groups have special access to truth through their suffering, then any evidence that contradicts their claims becomes not just wrong but literally a form of violence. Statistics about crime rates, economic data about income disparities, psychological research about gender differences, all of this becomes hate speech when it challenges the lived experience of oppressed groups. They've created a system where truth is subordinated to political utility, where facts must yield to feelings, where objective reality becomes less important than subjective experience. But Nietzsche's most devastating critique would be reserved for the progressive hatred of excellence itself. The woke movement's insistence that any institution, tradition, or standard that produces unequal outcomes must be inherently racist, sexist, or otherwise oppressive represents a fundamental attack on the very concept of human greatness. They've created a system where excellence is always suspect, where achievement is always potentially problematic, and where the very idea that some people might be better than others at certain things is treated as a form of violence. This isn't just egalitarianism, it's actively anti-excellence, a systematic attempt to tear down anything that might make some people feel bad about their own limitations. The progressive demand for equity, equal outcomes regardless of equal effort, would be seen by Nietzsche as the most life-denying ideology possible. They've taken the natural inequality that drives human striving and declared it illegitimate. They want a world where everyone gets a trophy, where no one fails, where difference is erased in favor of a gray uniformity that celebrates mediocrity and punishes excellence. This isn't just about helping the disadvantaged, it's about handicapping the advantaged, about ensuring that no one can rise too far above the common level, about creating a world where the highest aspiration is to be as average as possible. The attack on standardized testing exemplifies this perfectly. Rather than asking how to help underperforming groups achieve higher standards, the progressive response is to eliminate the standards themselves. Rather than inspiring people to work harder and achieve more, they've decided that the very concept of measurable achievement is oppressive. SAT scores, IQ tests, academic grades, professional certifications, all of these become tools of oppression when they reveal uncomfortable truths about human differences. They've created a system where the measurement of excellence becomes more problematic than the absence of excellence itself. The diversity, equity, and inclusion industry would represent to Nietzsche the institutionalization of slave morality. Here is an entire professional class dedicated to ensuring that merit matters less than identity, that achievement is always viewed through the lens of oppression, that excellence is always suspect if it doesn't produce the right demographic outcomes. DEI doesn't just promote diversity, it actively punishes homogeneity, even when that homogeneity results from merit-based selection. They've created a system where the best person for the job is by definition the wrong person if they happen to be white, male, or straight. The progressive approach to art and literature would particularly disgust Nietzsche. The constant demand to decolonize curricula, to eliminate dead white males from reading lists, to judge artistic works primarily by the identity of their creators rather than their quality, all of this would strike him as the ultimate triumph of mediocrity over greatness. They've created a system where Shakespeare is problematic because he was a white male, where Beethoven is suspect because he was European, where the greatest achievements of human culture are dismissed not because they lack merit but because they were created by people with the wrong demographics. The sensitivity reader phenomenon would horrify Nietzsche. Here is a system where books are pre-censored to ensure they don't contain anything that might offend any possible reader, where creativity is subordinated to the comfort of the most fragile audience members, where art is evaluated not by its power to move or challenge but by its ability to avoid causing discomfort. They've created a world where the greatest sin an artist can commit is making someone feel bad, where the highest virtue is inoffensiveness, where beauty and truth must yield to therapeutic concerns. This is why Nietzsche would see contemporary leftism not as a political movement but as a spiritual sickness, a nihilistic attack on life itself. They've taken every value that makes human existence worth living and inverted it. Strength becomes oppression, beauty becomes privilege, truth becomes violence, and excellence becomes injustice. They've created a world where the highest aspiration is to be as weak, as victimized, and as mediocre as possible. This isn't just wrong, it's anti-human, a systematic attempt to reduce human beings to their lowest common denominator. The man who wrote "Become Who You Are" would be horrified by a movement that insists you can become whatever you want to be, that biology is meaningless, that reality is constructed, and that individual responsibility is a myth. They've taken his call for self-creation and turned it into self-destruction, his celebration of human potential and turned it into a denial of human nature itself. The Übermensch was supposed to create values through strength and will. Instead, we have a generation that creates identity through weakness and complaint. Nietzsche would see the entire progressive project as the final triumph of nihilism, the belief that nothing matters, that all values are arbitrary, that truth is just power, and that the only authentic response to existence is to tear down whatever previous generations built. They've created a culture of permanent revolution against reality itself, where the only consistent principle is the destruction of all principles. This isn't reform or progress, it's cultural suicide, a systematic attempt to destroy everything that makes civilization possible. The progressive hatred of tradition would particularly appall Nietzsche. While he was certainly critical of many traditional values, he understood that tradition represents the accumulated wisdom of generations, that it provides the foundation on which new values can be built, that destruction without creation leads only to chaos. The progressive approach is purely destructive: tear down the patriarchy, smash white supremacy, eliminate capitalism, destroy the nuclear family. But what comes after? The answer is always vague because the movement is fundamentally nihilistic, more interested in destruction than creation. And perhaps most tragically, Nietzsche would recognize that this nihilistic slave morality has won not through strength but through weakness, not through creating better values but through destroying all values, not through building a higher culture but through reducing all culture to the lowest common denominator. The slaves have inherited the earth, and they're systematically destroying everything that made it worth inheriting. They've created a world where the strong are ashamed of their strength, where the beautiful apologize for their beauty, where the excellent hide their excellence, where the healthy feel guilty about their health. This is the irony that would not be lost on Nietzsche. A movement that claims to be about liberation has created the most oppressive system imaginable, where everyone is constantly monitored for signs of privilege, where every word is scrutinized for potential offense, where every achievement is viewed with suspicion, where every difference is pathologized. They've created a world that is the exact opposite of the free, creative, life-affirming existence that Nietzsche envisioned for humanity. The last man has not just arrived, he has conquered, and he is systematically destroying everything that once made human life worth living.